So we're going to talk about modern monetary theory for a bit. Christine, I encourage you to jump in because you are a guru of this stuff. You're a disciple. I'm learning. I would first say that this movie, Finding the Money, which stars a lot of the MMT economists that are sort of the main evangelists of this idea, are in it. It's very well done. It's very engaging. It's got a lot of helpful graphics and descriptions, explanations. I thought it was concise and it doesn't go down rabbit holes that are difficult to understand. I thought it was about as good as you could do a job in a movie. So if you are interested in learning about this subject, I would highly recommend you check out the movie. You can rent it now. It's on most channels to rent, like Amazon or Apple. You can rent it there, and a good, very well spent hour and a half. And I found myself pausing it or going back and taking notes, and I thought it was very, very well done. So give it a shot. So some ideas here about MMT. You've probably heard a little bit about it. Do not assume this is mainstream economics, meaning there is a very active debate among economists fighting it out. There's sort of an MMT school, and there's a sort of mainstream school. They are not on the same page. There are some aspects that are not controversial that both sides would agree on, and there are some aspects that are controversial, and I'm going to try to point those differences out as we go, kind of where we get into territory that is controversial. I'll say that for you, and we'll try to explain it. I'm going to ask also Karl to watch the chat if there's a question, and as I go from slide to slide, by all means, jump in and ask. So Christine mentioned earlier, this really applies when you are the sovereign, you print your own money. If you are using some other country's money, or you have your debt denominated in another country, like if you are a South American country with your debt denominated in dollars, these things are not going to, this theory does not apply to you directly. I'm going to use the US as an example, a country where we print our own money. Our debt is denominated in dollars, and we'll use that as our example. So in the movie, they have sort of 5 core ideas of MMT. There are others, but this was a list more or less from the movie. The first one being the federal government can issue more dollars whenever it needs to. It can't run out of them. When we ran into the pandemic, we had the CARES Act under Trump, and this was in 2020, and the government conjured 2-point-something trillion dollars and cut a bunch of checks and other benefits to people practically overnight. The government didn't have to do some special bond issuance to get the money. The government didn't have to raise your taxes to get the money from somebody. It just, when there's legislation that says, come up with $2 trillion and spend it, the Federal Reserve will conjure that money and put it in the government's account so that it can spend it. So the Treasury Department can spend it based on the legislation. The legislation essentially says, conjure the money and pay it in this way. Again, that is not, by the way, controversial. All the economists out there will agree that that is what the government can and does do regularly. The spending concept, and we'll get into this as we go through these, the spending and the funding are 2 different ideas. Keep those ideas separate in your brain. When the government has legislation that says spend, it will conjure the money and spend. And then it can decide separately if it wants to tax to get the money, get some money, or if it wants to issue bonds or whatever it wants to do to so-called fund it. It can. It just conjures the money. It can always do that. It cannot run out of dollars. The government could, if it wanted to tomorrow, conjure $25 trillion and pay off all of the treasury bonds that are out there if legislation told it to do so. Now, not saying that's desirable. There are other consequences, just saying there is no limit. The credit card of the federal government is infinite. That's number 1. Number 2, again, that gets at the title of the movie. Finding the money is never the problem. The government, all you need is legislation, and the government will find the money. It conjures it electronically. There have been a couple of sort of famous interviews on 60 Minutes. One was with Ben Bernanke during the Great Recession, another one with Fed Chair Chair Powell, where they just said, yeah, we conjure the money when we need to. We come up with it. So you can always get the money. The problem is if you have the government says we want to build 100 nuclear plants with that money, that doesn't mean that there's going to be labor available to do that. And that's where you get inflation. When the government says, I'm going to take all these resources away from building roads, bridges, and everything else and get them into building a nuclear of 100 nuclear power plants, they have to pay a lot more money to redirect all those resources. That drives up wages, that drives inflation. And so the real resources, labor and capital, are the real constraint here. Government can't just do whatever it wants when it comes to, again, I'm using the 100 nuclear plants as an example. If the government wanted to spend $10 trillion to do that, it's still going to have problems getting people and you would have inflation. And so that's where the real constraint is. It's not in the government can't conjure the money. It's the government could face inflation if it tried to redirect resources, finite resources, to accomplish it. If you are in a recession where all those resources are unemployed, sitting on the sidelines, conjuring the money should not create inflation. You could put them back to work at reasonable rates. It's when you are at full employment that you face an inflationary challenge, kind of like we've had recently where unemployment has been in the threes, which is extremely low historically, and we've had inflation. So number two, again, not particularly controversial. You can always get the money. What you can't do is get all the resources you want at a cheap price. Number three, we've kind of covered that you don't tax first to get the money. Again, keep the spending idea and the funding idea separate. You don't need to get the money from taxes or from bonds first before you spend. The legislation tells the Fed to just put the money into the government's account and it can spend it. The question is then, what does that do? Number two is your real issue there. The third one is really interesting, and the movie does a great job of explaining the history. And Christine, to her credit, has tried to explain this stuff to us in some of our prior discussions. And that is that the real reason you tax is to give the government a certain amount of power to direct resources because you require that the taxes be paid in that currency. So, for example, if people were just exchanging gold with each other, and then all of a sudden the government says, we want you to use the dollars, people will be like, forget it. We're happy with gold. We don't know what that paper money is. Just get rid of that. We're fine. But when you force them to pay the taxes in the dollars, then they start using the dollars. And so the taxes are an interesting way to drive the demand for the currency. And it forces them to use the dollars as a medium of exchange. And it also, as using my example before of the building 100 nuclear plants, if they decided to do that suddenly, that allows the government to prioritize resource allocation because it's the one that's going to have all that money and start paying people. And since they're accepting the currency, they're taking it, they can redirect those resources without drafting people, without conscription. They can use the free market forces to do that by paying them more to do those activities that the government is demanding. Now, in extreme examples, obviously a war, World War or something, the government may conscript people to do things, but it gives them a lot of power to use the dollars. And that's why when you think about Bitcoin and all these other sort of currencies that are floating around out there, those undermine the government's ability to do this. And so that's sort of that, I'm not a libertarian expert, but it's that idea of get me away from government control. I want to use my own currency, the Bitcoin. That takes away the government's power and the ability to redirect resources. And then last is that money is an IOU. And it's hard to think of it because I think of a dollar in my pocket as an asset. It's an asset for me, but that means that it's essentially a liability for the government. If it's my asset, it's got to be somebody's liability. And so you think of a dollar bill as a $1 debt of the Treasury, like a bond, but it doesn't have any interest. There's no interest on it. I just have it. And that paying taxes takes that down, meaning if I have to give a bunch of that to the government in taxes, the government is essentially destroying money that it created. All it does is if the government created $1 trillion and put it out there in the world and taxes back 800 billion of that, that 800 billion vanishes into the ether. It's not $800 billion bills that are sitting in the vault somewhere. That money is gone, essentially. It vanishes. And so governments create money by conjuring it into existence through legislation and spending it, and they destroy money by taxing it out of the system. I'm going to pause there. Christine, would you like to add any comments to what I've said on this page?
The only thing I really don't like is your use of the word fund.
What word do you like?
The purpose of taxes is to prevent inflation by reducing the amount of free money in the economy. The second way that the government uses to pull free money out of the economy is through selling treasuries and other T-bills and other investment vehicles. Just like a movie theater issues you a ticket for a movie, and then when you redeem the ticket, in the past, they would literally rip it in half.
Yep.
Right? They
Yep.
issued a token, they destroyed a token. Because to the movie theater, it's just a token.
Yep.
To our federal government, because they issue currency, okay, they issue the US dollar, they issue it when they spend it, they destroy it when they tax it back. Because to the federal government, it's just a token.
Great. And this part, by the way, what I've spoken about here may seem strange, but this is not the controversial part. Like if you had Alan Greenspan in a room, he said some of these things. If you have Bernanke, they will say this stuff. This is not the controversial part of MMT.
Those are not economists.
Well, there you go.
Those were our head bankers.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. If you want to know how money actually works, you probably want to talk to a banker.
So these now, and even this part right here is not controversial either. This is the debt or liability of the Fed or the government. It's an IOU. That's what a dollar is. It doesn't pay any interest. And I mentioned it's an asset of the person that holds it. It was redeemable in gold when we were on a gold standard, theoretically. But think of it as, your asset if you're holding it, and when you give it back to the government through taxes, they're basically going to destroy it. And that's the dollar. And then if people are holding dollars and they want interest, rather than just holding an instrument, the $1 bill that doesn't give them any interest, the government can issue a bond and they can switch those dollars for a bond. And this also allows the Fed to control interest rates to a great extent by buying and selling these bonds, as Christine mentioned. The Treasury bonds are normally going to pay interest. There are zero coupon bonds, which you get them at a discount and you hold them to maturity, and that's kind of where your gain comes from. It's a capital gain instead of a distribution. That's called a zero coupon. There's no interest payment in the middle. This image I found here of an old, I think it's a Treasury bond. What is this thing officially? Treasury note, it's called. There at the top. It paid 8%, way back when. Now, this is the stuff that'll give you a headache. And there's almost no way for me to explain this in a way that's going to make sense. I'm going to try, but mostly I want to illustrate. You can go to the source that's at the bottom here. This is one of the premier MMT guys, L. Randall Wray. And there is a PDF that you can find. It's called How Does the Federal Government Really Spend Money? It's an excerpt from his book, which is the Modern Monetary Theory, book. It has it's focused on these graphics, which are the scenario I'm showing you here is for what's called a balanced budget scenario. There's another one that's more involved that gets into the not balanced budget scenario, the deficit spending scenario, and gets a little more complicated in terms of what's happening on different people's books. So it took me a long time to get my mind around this. It's not simple. Understand I'm a CPA. It isn't, and this is mostly accounting. It's still challenging intellectually to get your brain around this. So when I go through it, if it blows your mind, I would just say, check out Randall Wray's PDF. You can search it, it'll come up, and you can download it and read it at your leisure. But it's fascinating, and it gets into the workings of kind of the plumbing of the financial system. And this is where the MMT people that are real MMT gurus, this is where they live. Follow them on Twitter. When you see what MMT people are talking about back and forth, they're talking about stuff like this. And so I want to go through it briefly, but understand if you're lost, there's nothing wrong with you. And I really struggle with it too. And again, I'm a CPA, so it just bear with me. All right. So, and Christine, if you have any thoughts as we go through this, by all means, jump in and let me get started here.
Real quick,
So, yeah, go ahead.
everything is a trade. So just imagine when the government is doing something, it wants to trade something for something else, right? In most of our circumstances, we trade something real with a token we call money. And so somewhere other in the environment, there's a trade in the other way.
All right, thank you. So what we're going to do on the left-hand side box is we're going to talk about, then there's three sets of books here. The government, so you can think of the Fed and the Treasury Department combined. Once you break them out, it gets another layer of complexity in there, but let's think government. Private bank, meaning the bank of a corporation. And then the private non-bank entity here, the example we're using, think like Boeing. That's the company that makes the jet that the government wants here. And so the private bank would be Boeing's bank. Okay, whatever bank they're using, JP Morgan Chase, whatever, that's their bank. And then we have the government. So here's a case of the government wants to buy a jet and it's going to pay for it. In this case, we said this balanced budget scenario. So the government says, I want a jet. It's going to buy it from Boeing. And then it sets up a tax to pay for it. The Boeing jet tax or whatever you want, it's going to impose a tax on the world, on US citizens to pay for it. So the government, it conjures the money, right? There's legislation that says buy this jet. The government conjures the money and pays it and establishes a tax liability that it's going to collect from the citizens to pay for that jet. Notice that I should say pay for it. They already paid for it when they bought the jet. It's just they're choosing to keep the deficit down. They are funding it, so to speak. And Christine doesn't like that word, but they are getting money. They are getting money out of the system to so-called pay for it, but that isn't. They've already paid for it when they conjured the money. So on the government's books, they now have a jet. They bought it from Boeing. They have it says tax liability. This is an asset, meaning people owe the government money. It's a tax receivable, would have probably been a better language that I like, but there's a reason why Randall Ray does it this way. So it's an asset for the government. We owe the government money, so it's going to be our liability as citizens, but for the government, it's an asset. The government is owed the tax. On the other side of the coin here, on the liability side, the government has created these reserves. So it created lots of those $1 bills. So remember, those are our assets as people. They are liabilities of the government. That's what the reserve is here. And the net worth is really, it's a little bit tricky to explain, but think of it as the government has a jet now, and it also is going to collect money from people. So it is sort of increased its net worth by the value of that jet. It said, I want stuff that used to be in the private sector and now it's mine. So the net worth of the government is now going up because it's now got a jet that used to be sitting in the private sector. And this reserve here and I'll show you where that is in the banking system. This reserve is a money supply increase. The government conjured the money, sent it out into the world for the jet, and that's an increase in the money supply. And it shows up here in the bank in Boeing's bank account as the reserve. These are offsetting. There's one side of the entry, there's the other. And Christine, can people see my cursor if it's on my screen? Just to be clear, is that visible?
Yes, it's visible.
All right. So that's where the offset is here. And then my initials are DD, but that's not what this stands for. This stands for demand deposit. I've got notes down here. That is the bank is giving, this is Boeing's account. So the bank, it's in Boeing's account. That's a liability for the bank. It's an asset for Boeing. That is their deposit account. They got the money for giving the government the jet. Boeing is out one jet, so their books are off. They're out of one jet, and it's on their books as a tax liability, but it's not all going to be on Boeing's books alone. Think of this as a tax liability of all the citizens that are going to pay that. And their net worth is down because they think of it this way, and it's a little confusing because you think of a corporation as making a profit when it sells a jet, so its net worth would go up. What this is just saying is, if you think about all of the private non-bank entities in the universe, all these corporations, the net worth is just going down by the amount of that jet. The jet went to the government and came out of the net worth of Boeing. It's not, they don't have this on their books anymore. They've got a demand deposit instead. It's almost like trying to explain this piece of the net worth is tricky. It's like, I'm still wrestling with how to explain it. It is equal to the tax liability, but It's not a simple concept to explain. If you think of it as the government bought it at cost, I just don't see why it's a big negative. I would see it as, I don't see any impact on the net worth of the bank. So I'm struggling with that, but that's kind of how it's explained here. Christine, have you got any insight on how to explain that
Well,
net worth?
by the way, you're pointing at the non-bank entity.
That's Boeing. This is Boeing's
Well,
books.
that's everyone that has a tax liability
Right.
that is going
That's
to
true.
cover the tax liability to cover for the Boeing jet.
Right. That makes more sense. So you would say
Okay.
this is all the private non-bank entities, not one.
Yes.
It's all of them. That makes sense. That's better.
Now, if the world only consisted of Boeing, okay, this is why this discussion gets really funny when you talk about when it gets too simple, right? If Boeing gets paid, $1 billion for a jet, and then turns around and has to turn and pay $1 billion for the tax liability, all that happened was a plane moved from Boeing to the federal government. Boeing's net worth actually dropped by a jet.
Right. Yep. Yep.
So a break-even government budget is harmful.
Yeah. It reduces the net worth of the private sector
Yes,
by
cost of a jet.
by that jet. Yep. Key point. Thank you. So again, like I said, this is complicated. I struggle with it too. Now here's the explanation from Randall Ray. The government gets the jet. The private seller gets a demand deposit. There's the DD. And there it is on the bank side. Note that the tax liability reduces the seller's net worth and increases the government's. After all, that is the purpose of taxes, to move resources to the government. The private bank gets a reserve deposit at the government. There's the reserve here, reserve here. All right. Now I have some notes here. These are not from Randall Ray. So government is the Treasury and Fed combined. The reserves are liabilities of the government. That's this one up here. A demand deposit is like a checking account. The private non-bank entity, the maker of the plane. I like Christine's interpretation better. This is all of the private non-bank entities, not just one entity. And I put in assumes after-tax profit from sale of aircraft is zero. There's no net worth gain for the corporation from this. I'm not 100% sure that's right, but I'm sticking with it till I hear better. So and how is the chat going? And how are people doing? Are you completely clueless or completely lost, or are you kind of hanging in there? How are we doing?
For the people who are new to this,
Anybody want to admit it?
Mark Lundholm asked, wouldn't the jet also depreciate in value? And Christine said that adds complexity, not useful for this discussion. I would suggest that we, in the future, go ahead and have a separate meeting to discuss modern monetary theory for the folks that are really interested in it, and not make it part of our fiscal and economic issues discussion.
yeah, but here's the problem. You spent 30 minutes talking about a deficit, and everyone complains that it's bad, and we're trying to make the statement that view is probably invalid.
Now, let's table that debate for now. Let's get through this, but we'll talk about that offline to see if that makes sense to do it separately. But this is part of the argument that MMT is going to make, and we'll get there in a bit, is that deficits matter only to the extent that they affect inflation. That you shouldn't be afraid of deficits. You shouldn't be afraid of debt. You should be worried about inflation, and there are solutions to inflation, which is mainly raising taxes to take money out of the system if there's too much in there. And so,
David,
yeah,
real quick, those statements only apply to our federal government.
Right.
Okay, it doesn't apply to the states and locals and counties, because only our federal government can create dollars out of thin air.
That's right.
Because they have to create dollars out of thin air.
Can't get them anywhere else. Yep. So, all right. So I think what I'm going to do is pause. So just the idea here, I wanted you to get a sense of the complexity and kind of the ideas that when you dig into MMT, that you're going to run into is this debits and credits idea and trying to get your mind around it. If you're interested in it, definitely see the movie to get the overview. They don't get into this kind of detail in the movie, but if you want to dig down into that MMT 102 layer, that's where you read Randall Ray's the source that I've got down there at the bottom. And so the other side of this, I'm not going to go through it in detail. It's just the reverse, more or less, of what we talked about, which is when the tax actually gets paid, a lot of these things operate in reverse, and we go from there. So let me move to the next one. This is from an article in The Hill, and they were interviewing, where is it? Stephanie Kelton, who is one of the other, probably the most visible MMT advocate that's out there. She's a star in the movie, and she's the one that the different journalists usually go to get an understanding of what sort of the view. But this is where you get into something that is definitely controversial. And this is the idea that when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, that can be stimulative to the economy. Usually you hear that that is something that slows the economy, that raising rates makes stuff harder to, the people, corporations can't borrow as cheaply, so they invest less. It slows down the economy. Not as many houses get built because mortgage rates are higher. Usually the Federal Reserve, by affecting that lever, by raising rates, slows the economy and theoretically slows inflation. The MMT view is the opposite, that when the Fed raises rates, that generates a lot more interest income in the economy, which is more than offsetting. Understand that is highly controversial. Mainstream economists do not agree with that assertion. And so the stuff we've talked about up to this point is pretty much not controversial. This now gets pretty controversial when you talk about, like, MMT economists would say, cut those interest rates. Don't, well, if you're raising interest rates, do it because you want to generate a lot more revenue in the economy, a lot more interest income flowing in the economy. We showed you slides earlier about how giant those deficits are getting just from the interest alone. The MMT people look at that as stimulus. Go for it. If you don't have inflation, if inflation is not problematic, feel free. So again, controversial. And now, kind of, why might an MMT person think that way? And so let's look at some of the numbers in the economy to give you a sense of it. On the left-hand side, you have sort of the mainstream view of, when the government raises interest rates, it makes it more expensive for consumers and businesses to borrow. Think of your credit card rates are higher, mortgage rates are higher, businesses aren't going to invest as much if they have to pay a lot more in interest. It slows the economy through various ways. Households have about 13 trillion in mortgages. However, most of them were already sort of grandfathered, if you will. They were already paid, already entered into before the latest round of increases. So right now, the average mortgage rate is like 4. It's not 7 or 8 like if you were to get a new mortgage today. It's 4%. And so also, there's less turnover in the homes as refinancing gets expensive. You have consumer credit of 5 trillion between auto, credit card, and student loans. All the interest rates on that go up. Government's getting rid of the student loans, but normally all the interest rates go up and these things get expensive for households. They're more expensive than they would be otherwise. And businesses have to pay more on corporate bonds that they issue. They will usually do fewer projects because they have what's internally called a cost of capital, meaning they don't do a project that they would have to borrow to fund unless it has a much higher return ratio. So maybe stuff that they used to require 5% return on, now, because it's cost more to borrow, they might require 10% or 15% internal rate of return on those investments, so they don't do them. So they also delay their capital expenditures, hoping for lower rates. So these are all things that are mainstream ideas that are, right out of your economics textbook. On the other side of the coin, sort of the MMT way of thinking about it, there's about 114 trillion in financial assets out there. And I got a breakdown in there. This is households, 114 trillion. So stock and mutual funds, pension entitlements, cash, savings, money markets, equities, bonds, other assets. Many of these things are interest bearing. Many of them are, when rates go up, they're going to be getting more income. So you've got this giant base of assets, 114 trillion, that theoretically some portion of it, or a larger portion, is going to be getting more income, is going to the holders of those assets, and then they can then spend it. I put a note here in italics that the U.S. bond market is over 50 trillion alone, About half of it's government bonds, half of it is corporate and others. I just wanted to distinguish that from the 5 trillion that are held by households. That would mean that 45 trillion of that is probably out there. Banks, corporations own them, not households. But if you assume that at least on that, 25 trillion or so of treasury bonds, those are now paying interest at 5% as opposed to 2% that they were paying before. And that's an awful lot of money being injected in the system. And Karl showed how much that was on the deficits, that interest. We think of it as, and this is to Christine's point, you think of it as bad. We've got this government debt, we've got all these interest payments, but that money is going to the private sector. The bondholders are getting that interest money, and then they can spend it or invest it or do whatever. So that's kind of what you'll see with the MMT folks saying. She's saying that Kelton is saying, are we at a tipping point where the interest payments are finding their way into the hands of enough people who are spending them? Then you can anticipate some reacceleration in inflation, meaning that there's so much money going into the bondholders and they're spending it on stuff that you could see inflation going up. But she's saying that's not what's happening. Inflation is coming down, but the GDP, the growth is actually doing very well. We had a slow quarter that Karl shared earlier, but recently it's been very solid growth. She's saying if the Fed rate hikes were working the way Powell is trying to convince us they are, you got to wonder, how do you define working? What's the mechanism? Why is it that growth is accelerating while inflation is falling? That's not what should be happening. You would expect growth to be slowing and inflation to be slowing along with it. The fact that they're moving opposite directions is surprising. That's not typical. All right, so those are basics. Let me pause there. Questions, comments?
Thank you. It's pretty clear. I mean, yeah, very complex subject, but thank you for the presentation. Yeah, it's very helpful.
If you look up, if you have access to Bloomberg, Stephanie Kelton has done some interviews with Bloomberg. If you look up her generally, that you will find a series of sources that are she tries really hard to explain the stuff in English. She also has a book called, what is it called? The Deficit Myth. And she's trying to say that the way we think about deficits, that debt is bad, that deficits are bad, you should think of the offset to that every time somebody says the government's running a deficit, you say, great, that means the private sector is running a surplus. And every time they say, oh my God, we're running this giant deficit and all these interest payments are being made by the government, it's like, yeah, those are receipts of the private sector. Those are people getting those. And when they say the national debt is 34 trillion, the corporate bond, the treasury bonds are like 25 or 7 or something like that of that number. It's like, yeah, those are assets of the private sector. So the negative connotation of debt, deficits, interest payments, as an exercise, every time you hear that, try to spin it the other way and see if you get as scared. Is that really that scary that there's 25 trillion in assets held by citizens of the U.S. in treasury bonds? Is that so bad? I don't know. I mean, if the unemployment is really low and inflation is reasonably tame, is that so bad? I don't know. I mean, so anyway, see the movie.
I think it's a losing political argument this year.
Sorry, go ahead.
I said, given that everyone's really concerned about their 3% inflation, I think that this is a losing political argument this year.
Maybe it probably runs better in a recession. It sells better, I bet, when the economy when you can spend big, or you should. It's going to sell better, but the theory doesn't change one way or the other. I mean, the MMT guys would just be saying, if you got inflation, you should be taxing more. And, as progressives, we want to tax the rich, but realistically, you got to tax the people who are spending. And that tends to be about the top 20% tend to be the ones that spend, like the top 20%. I think it's more are buying about 50% or 40 or 50% of the stuff. So if you tax the top 20%, you're going to really slow down the economy. And that's
why you don't actually want to tax the money that is moving through the economy. What you want to do is find a way to tax the money that isn't moving.
Would that be a wealth tax, or how would you do it?
Yes, it would have to be like a wealth tax. Amy. To respond to your question, when people compare the federal deficit to a household deficit, isn't that not the same thing or applicable? Do you want to speak to that, David, or shall I?
You start, and I'll pitch in if I feel necessary.
Okay. When it comes down to it, Amy, unless you're going to commit counterfeiting, you can't create a dollar bill. Can the federal government create a dollar bill? Yes. So fundamentally, at a extremely fundamental level, you can't create money. The federal government can. They must be different. A federal government budget and a non-federal government budget cannot be equivalent. So to pretend they are just makes bad decisions happen.
I mean, the other way I look at it is as we go into recession, as we've done a few times over the last 20 years, the government will tend to go ahead and increase spending to help households manage the effect of the recession, the loss of income, et cetera. The friends that say that they want to compare it to a household budget, I mean, if we didn't go ahead and expand unemployment benefits and other benefits during the pandemic, we would have had much higher unemployment, and it just, it would have been a much bigger disaster.
I think one of the really important takeaways of these principles to me is when people say you should do austerity in a recession, meaning the threat is the big deficit, because when you have a recession, you're going to have a big deficit, right? Revenues have fallen because people are out of work, and the spending of the government is going up because of things like unemployment insurance. Those are called automatic stabilizers. When that's happening, the government can always get the money. It can always put all those people back to work. Staying in a recession is a policy choice. Let me say that again. Staying in a recession is a policy choice. And I think that's the lesson that I took away from MMT. And there's a lot more to it as we've been talking about it, and I'm learning more about it. But the idea that you have to stay in a recession, that it took what, Karl, 7 years to get back to our pre-Great Recession employment level, like 2007 to 14? Was it that long? Or it was like,
yeah, I mean, basically
it was like the end of, the peak employment was like the end of 07 or early 08 before the Great Recession. And we didn't get back there until May of 2014. We had 7 years of jobs below the level we had before the Great Recession. What MMT tells you is you don't need to suffer like that. You can put those people back to work by conjuring the money and either putting checks in their pockets or build some things, not 100 nuclear plants, but you get my drift. If there's a recession, you don't need to stay there, because you don't need to tax people more to get the money. You don't need to issue bonds to get the money to spend. You can just conjure it based on legislation. And that is not a conservatives are certainly not comfortable with that. That is probably the best thing you can do. And it's consistent with what Keynes said theoretically, my favorite quote from him, which is the boom, not the slump, is the right time for austerity at the Treasury. You raise taxes and cut spending when you're in a boom. You don't do that when you're in a slump. The slump is when you want to spend. And so that, I think, is, to me, is the takeaway is you don't need to stay in a recession. Should one happen, and they inevitably are gonna, you don't need to stay there. You can get back to full employment, because you shouldn't theoretically get a lot of inflation if you are putting people back to work when they're on the sidelines.
I mean, the Great Recession was the first recession since the 30s where we cut spending as a percentage of GDP before we'd fully recovered the job. Every other recession under Republican and Democratic presidents, we increased spending as a percentage of GDP until we'd fully recovered the lost jobs.
Yeah.
Because of the Tea Party and others, we got real concerned, and President Obama got real concerned about deficits and spending. And so the recovery was much, much slower than it should have been.
It was a terrible economic strategy. And yeah, the good news is we had a really low budget deficit. By like 2015, it was like below the historical average. It was like 2.5% of GDP. It was tiny. And what did that get us? Whoopee. What time is it, by the way?
What was one of the shortest recessions that ever occurred?
Pardon?
What was one of the shortest recessions we've ever had?
Yeah, this one.
Pandemic.
What happened when we we went into the pandemic? Oh, that's right. The federal government unloaded multiple trillions of dollars on the economy.
Yep. Yeah, checks and pockets is the way to go. You don't need shovel-ready projects. If you remember, everybody was like, "You got to have a shovel-ready product to have a stimulus." Like, no, you don't. You can put a check in somebody's pocket. It works quite well, and we proved that. So just that austerity in a downturn idea was the mainstream view of people, not necessarily economists, but it was the mainstream view of sort of the politicians and the citizens, and that was terrible. And that was a lot of conservative marketing, and they succeeded. And Obama eventually bought it, and that was bad.
And David,
Yeah.
one last thing. Mark Lundholm has a question.
Yes.
Mark, do you want to speak to it, or shall I?
Question is, how would a basic universal income affect this?
I'm so anti that concept right now, so I'll leave that to others to answer. So
the MMT people tend to say that once you have freed up policy space by fundamentally understanding that deficits do not functionally matter, it's inflation, the MMTers generally do not support universal basic incomes. What they do support is a job guarantee. So if you have a resource that's underutilized, a person who wants to work without a job, and you give them a job, then how could that be inflationary? It's a freed resource. Now, if we take a couple steps down the line, now this person has potentially more income, they could create more demand in the environment. That could drive more trade. You do enough of that, you could probably drive some inflation. But universal basic income, which is just spraying money into the world, Stephanie, Randall Ray, they generally don't support that concept.
Really? I thought they did. Oh, I didn't know. I wasn't sure. I would have thought they would. Okay, cool.
Not
better.
Universal basic income. They support a job guarantee. Remember, everything they talk about is the job of money is for the federal government to move resources from the private space to the public space. The fact that the rest of us happen to use them is a happy coincidence.
Let's leave the MMT stuff and let's go on.